The morning sun cut through the mist that clung to the camp like a thin veil, revealing rows of barracks standing in rigid symmetry. Japanese soldiers, worn down by months of grueling combat and endless marches, shuffled forward under the watchful eyes of Allied guards. Their uniforms hung loose, faded and tattered, the seams fraying like the edges of their own resolve. Each man carried the weight of hunger, fatigue, and the unspoken dread of what awaited beyond the barbed wire fences. The camp itself was unnervingly serene. Unlike the chaotic, makeshift holding areas they had endured in the Pacific, this place breathed order. The air smelled faintly of wood polish and freshly chopped firewood, and the gravel paths crunched underfoot in a cadence that seemed almost deliberate, almost ceremonial. For soldiers accustomed to the stench of rotting provisions and the constant, gnawing threat of death, the neat rows of bunks and the careful separation of latrines from living areas felt alien, too meticulous to be comfortable. As they passed through the main gate, their eyes darted from one carefully maintained corner to another. Guards moved with a composed discipline but without malice. They nodded curtly or said a word or two in clipped English, their voices calm, almost banal. There was no shouting, no brutality, no fearsome intimidation. Only structure. The POWs, whose minds had been sharpened by years of survival in extremity, could not decide if this was a trap or an illusion. Many of the men carried memories of starvation with them, nights spent clutching their stomachs as the ache of emptiness gnawed deeper than the fever and exhaustion ever could. The concept of abundance was foreign. The idea of comfort bordered on sacrilege. Yet here, in this strange new world, the very environment whispered of possibility, of a life that could still hold some measure of dignity. One soldier, Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka, later recounted in his diary, "I could not believe the cleanliness. The barracks were almost shining. I thought perhaps we had been brought here to die in some orderly way, like animals in cages with polite attendants. But there was something in the way the sun caught the wooden planks, something human, almost tender. It made me wonder if the world I had known, starvation, fear, and relentless orders, was not the only one." As they were guided to their quarters, the contrast between expectation and reality weighed heavily on them. Memories of malnourished comrades, of the acrid smoke from burning rice husks, and the endless monotony of meager rations pressed against the present moment like a shadow refusing to yield. Yet the camp's calmness, the faint aroma of cooked food lingering in the distance, and the absence of immediate threats created a dissonance that none could reconcile. For many, the arrival was a first encounter with the notion that war might hold spaces not defined purely by cruelty. The camp's order, its quiet, and the faint glimmer of normalcy was more disorienting than any ambush or bombardment. And as they settled, uncertain and wary, the first whispers of anticipation began to stir. Anticipation for a meal unlike any they had known, for a bread so soft it seemed impossible, for a world that was quietly and subtly foreign. It was here, at the threshold of hunger and abundance, that the prisoners first understood the psychological weight of expectation. Survival had taught them to fear, to distrust, to brace against the worst. Yet the very normalcy around them, calm guards, orderly rows, and the subtle unspoken care of their captors, introduced a new tension, hope. The clang of metal trays echoed faintly through the barracks as the prisoners were herded toward the mess hall. The air smelled faintly of yeast and warmth, a smell that seemed almost otherworldly to men whose noses had been numbed by months of acrid smoke, dust, and the tang of rancid rice. At the center of each tray lay a simple slice of white bread, soft and pillowy, its surface smooth and almost luminous in the dim light of the camp. For many of the Japanese soldiers, this was a sensation that defied comprehension. Months of subsisting on meager rations, sometimes little more than thin soup or a handful of rice, had honed their senses to scarcity. Bread had existed in their imagination only as a distant, almost mythical luxury, whispered about by officers who sometimes smuggled a piece from rare shipments. To hold it in their hands was to grasp a tangible symbol of a world they had never known. A hush fell over the hall. Men stared at the bread as if it might vanish if they looked too closely. Some raised it to their lips with trembling fingers, hesitant as if committing a small act of sacrilege. Others simply held it in their hands, feeling the texture, marveling at the way it gave slightly under pressure, yet retained its shape, a softness so foreign it bordered on absurdity. Private Masaru Fujimoto later recounted in a letter, "It was like touching a cloud. I wanted to bite it, yet I feared it was a trick. Bread was not meant to be this soft. Bread was never a friend. And yet, there it was, smiling at me from the tray, a silent promise that hunger might end, even if only for a moment." Some men laughed softly, disbelieving, while others wept quietly, overcome by the absurdity of indulgence after so much suffering. The camp guards watched without interruption, allowing the prisoners to confront the simple yet staggering contrast between expectation and reality. The silence was heavy, almost sacred, punctuated only by the gentle rustle of hands on trays and the occasional low exhale of awe. It was not merely bread, it was a revelation, a confrontation with the notion that life could still offer small luxuries even amid the machinery of war. The bread embodied warmth, care, and humanity, concepts that had become distant abstractions in the jungles and battlefields they had left behind. In that moment, the slice of bread became a fulcrum of perception. Hunger had sharpened their minds to the point of obsession with survival. Yet here was an object that defied the logic of deprivation. Soft, white, and abundant, it was almost obscene in its generosity, a tactile proof that the enemy could provide, could nourish, could extend something resembling kindness. Some men hesitated to eat, fearful that indulgence might come at a cost. Others devoured it slowly, savoring each bite as if committing it to memory. The reactions varied, yet all were unified by disbelief. The psychological impact was profound. A simple loaf of bread had, in a single act, unsettled months of conditioning, broken the rigidity of expectation, and introduced a flicker of hope where only fatigue and resignation had existed. By the time the meal ended, the men had begun to understand that survival, in this place, might involve more than endurance. It could involve trust, a tentative engagement with care, and the surreal realization that even in wartime, life could offer moments of unexpected, almost luxurious reprieve. The soft white bread on the trays seemed almost unreal, yet to truly grasp its impact one must understand the shadow from which these men had emerged. Japanese soldiers had endured rations so minimal that the very concept of abundance had been stripped from their daily existence. Their sustenance was almost entirely rice-based, a thin, watery porridge in the mornings, a handful of boiled rice at midday, and a soup stretched thin over scraps of vegetables or occasionally fish. Protein, fats, even sugar, were luxuries rarely seen. Each soldier's ration was calculated to sustain mere functionality, not strength, comfort, or satisfaction. Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka had recorded in his wartime diary, "We ate as much as the bowl allowed, yet our stomachs cried in protest. Hunger was constant, like a shadow that followed each step. Bread, soft, white bread, was a memory from a world we no longer inhabited." The monotony of these meals, compounded by exhaustion from forced marches and grueling labor, created a mental as well as physical deprivation. Food became not a source of pleasure, but a necessity measured strictly in survival. Allied rations, by contrast, reflected a fundamentally different philosophy. Nutritional value and morale were intertwined. Bread, meat, vegetables, and even occasional sweets were calculated to sustain not just the body, but the spirit. For POWs, a slice of bread carried with it the shock of realization. This enemy, the one they had been trained to fear, could nourish human beings without cruelty, without forcing them into the endless cycle of hunger and exhaustion. Private Masaru Fujimoto later recounted that the first bite felt almost scandalous. It was soft, warm, and full. It was like biting into a forbidden world. My mouth could not reconcile itself with the texture, the taste. How could such a thing exist in the midst of war? This reaction was, as shared by almost every man who had known deprivation. Bread was no longer a staple. It was an emblem of a life they had never imagined, a fleeting indulgence that felt almost sacrilegious. The comparison highlights more than just the physical scarcity. Japanese rations emphasized endurance, conformity, and a stoic acceptance of suffering. Bread, butter, or anything resembling luxury was systematically absent. Allied camps, on the other hand, treated prisoners not as expendable units, but as human beings capable of hope, memory, and recovery. The difference struck the men with a force disproportionate to the actual meal. It was a psychological blow as much as a physical one. Some soldiers even hesitated, instinctively suspecting hidden malice. A soft slice of bread seemed too generous, too indulgent, too luxurious to be offered freely. And yet, with each subsequent meal, it became increasingly clear that the Allied camps were not attempting deception. They were demonstrating a quiet humanity that the prisoners had rarely encountered in their lives. For the men who had spent months calculating calories, rationing morsels, and enduring starvation, bread was more than nourishment. It was a symbol of a world that contradicted every wartime expectation, a world where sustenance could be generous, consistent, and offered without ulterior motive. It was indulgence distilled into its simplest form, yet it carried a weight far greater than any weapon they had faced. The moment a prisoner lifted that slice of soft bread to his lips, something extraordinary occurred, not merely a response of hunger being sated, but a collision of expectation and reality. For months, perhaps years, these men had existed in a world defined by scarcity, discipline, and fear. Every bite had been rationed, every morsel calculated, every sense of comfort deferred or denied. And now, in a camp run by those they had been conditioned to view as enemies, they encountered an act of generosity so small yet so profound, it destabilized the mind. Softness, warmth, and abundance. The bread embodied a trinity of concepts that were almost incomprehensible. Private Kentamori described it later. I could feel my pulse quicken, my hand shook, though I did not know if it was from hunger or disbelief. To eat and not fear pain, to be fed and not punished, this was madness. I did not know whether to laugh or cry. It was not merely the physical act of eating, it was the realization that human decency could exist amidst war. That one bite of bread, ordinary to the Allied cooks, became a shockwave through the prisoner's psyche. Memories of starving comrades, of endless marches with nothing to chew, and the constant, gnawing anxiety of survival surfaced all at once, only to be juxtaposed against this tangible, simple comfort. The result was disorientation, a mental imbalance where reality seemed almost unreal. Many men froze, clutching their slices without tasting them, as if hesitation could prolong the miracle. Some whispered to one another, sharing silent astonishment. This was the first time they had been offered sustenance without expectation, without surveillance beyond the necessary, without judgment or cruelty. The psychological tension was palpable, relief intertwined with suspicion, gratitude interlaced with disbelief. The camp itself, with its calm routines and order, early distribution of food reinforced the mental jolt. Here, everything functioned as if humanity had not been eroded by war. Guards spoke kindly, meals were predictable, and medical care was provided with the same methodical efficiency as the bread distribution. The ordinary became extraordinary through contrast. The prisoners' minds, trained to anticipate suffering at every turn, were forced to adapt, to reconcile their instincts with evidence that the enemy could show care. Some soldiers later recorded that their first meals left them physically ill, not from the food itself, but from the emotional weight of experiencing care. The body, long accustomed to the adrenaline of survival under deprivation, struggled to process the safety and comfort suddenly extended. Hunger had dominated every thought, and now that absence of threat, combined with abundance, created an internal turbulence. Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka noted in his diary, "Bread. I never imagined that a slice of bread could carry a heart within it. It was not just food, it was security, warmth, memory of a home I had never returned to, a life that seemed impossible. For the first time I felt disarmed, not by force, but by kindness." In the quiet of that first meal, prisoners experienced a subtle yet profound psychological shift. Fear remained, certainly, the war had not ended, but hope, long suppressed and nearly forgotten, flickered tentatively. The soft bread was not just nourishment, it was a key that unlocked a world their minds had deemed unreachable, demonstrating that survival in this war could coexist with dignity and perhaps even humanity. The soft bread offered to the Japanese POWs was not simply a meal, it was a revelation, a glimpse into a culture where food carried meaning beyond mere survival. To understand the depth of their astonishment, one must look at the stark contrasts between Japanese military rations and the philosophy of sustenance that guided the Allied camps. For Japanese soldiers, food was measured, economical, and utilitarian. Every bowl of rice, every thin soup, every fragment of dried fish served a single purpose: to keep the body functioning for the next march, the next battle, the next grueling assignment. Nutrition was often calculated minimally, with little regard for taste, comfort, or the psychological needs of the soldier. Meals were brief, functional, and uniform, stripped of any indulgence or ceremony. Scarcity was internalized. Soldiers learned to anticipate hunger, to ration even in desperation, and to accept monotony as a part of duty. Allied food culture, in contrast, embraced both nutrition and morale. Each meal was carefully planned to meet caloric needs, yes, but also to sustain the mind and spirit. Bread, meat, vegetables, and even occasional sweets were not just fuel, they were signals of order, care, and stability. For the POWs, the soft white bread symbolized not only abundance, but an unspoken promise that their captors valued them as human beings capable of hope and recovery. The psychological contrast was stark. In Japanese camps, food scarcity reinforced discipline and stoicism. In Allied camps, food abundance reinforced morale and the possibility of life beyond suffering. Soldiers who had been trained to endure every conceivable hardship were now confronted with something that seemed almost obscene in its generosity. Bread, something ordinary to the Allies, became a mirror reflecting a world the prisoners had never imagined. Private Masaru Fujimoto recalled hours later, "We had survived on rice so thin it barely filled a bowl. Salted fish, dried leaves, scraps, and then a slice of soft bread appeared before us. It was like witnessing a small miracle. I could not reconcile my hunger with the ease of it, the care in it. Bread was no longer bread, it was life." The cultural dissonance extended beyond the mere mechanics of feeding. In Japan, the austerity of rations mirrored the strict hierarchies and rigid discipline of military life. Scarcity was a tool of obedience, endurance, a measure of loyalty. Allied camps, however, operated on a principle that care for the individual reinforced the greater strength of the group. Feeding prisoners well was a calculated act of humanity. It reduced illness, encouraged cooperation, and subtly undermined the mental conditioning imposed by enemy indoctrination. Bread thus became a symbol, a tangible illustration of abundance and order. Where Japanese soldiers had been accustomed to managing hunger like a constant adversary, here hunger was relieved almost effortlessly. The psychological impact was immediate. What was once unimaginable, the comfort of soft, fresh bread, suddenly became evidence of a world where war had not extinguished human decency. In this contrast, the POWs began to internalize a subtle truth. Nourishment was not only physical, but moral and psychological. Bread was a language, and its message was clear. Life could persist, hope could exist, and human kindness could still manifest even in the machinery of war. The rhythm of camp life was dictated as much by the rising sun as by the promise of the next meal. For the Japanese POWs, each day unfolded with a strange predictability that contrasted sharply with the chaos of the battlefields and the relentless uncertainty they had endured. Morning light spilled over the neatly arranged barracks, illuminating gravel paths that echoed with the careful footsteps of guards and the hesitant shuffles of prisoners still acclimating to this foreign environment. Mealtimes became the central anchor in this new reality. Each morning men lined up in orderly fashion, their trays clinking softly against one another as they received portions that were not merely sufficient but generous. Soft bread, hot soup, vegetables, and occasionally protein provided a consistency that had been almost unimaginable in months, even years, of military service. The distribution of food was deliberate and meticulous, designed not only to sustain the body, but to instill calm, routine, and a sense of order, an almost therapeutic counterpoint to the chaos they had known. At first, prisoners approached these meals with caution, skepticism etched into every movement. Some held their trays awkwardly, eyes darting to ensure there was no trap, no hidden insult behind the abundance. Others hesitated, savoring the bread with the careful deliberation of someone who had survived hunger for so long that indulgence itself felt like a sin. Private Kenta Mori later wrote, "Every morning I feared that today would be the day it would end. The bread, the soup, the simple warmth, it felt like a dream I could not wake from. Each bite was both relief and disbelief." Yet as days turned into weeks, the prisoners' expectations began to shift. The daily routine, initially alien and unsettling, became a stabilizing force. The bread no longer shocked, it reassured. Its presence signaled the SUS. At the camp operated under rules distinct from the relentless deprivation they had once known. Over time, the men learned to trust the rhythm of sustenance, to plan their days around meals that were no longer battles against hunger, but moments of quiet, almost meditative reflection. The camp's structured meals also fostered a subtle sense of community. Prisoners observed one another, shared small gestures of courtesy, and began to rebuild a social rhythm that had been suppressed in the harshness of combat. The act of breaking bread together became a quiet ritual, an unspoken acknowledgement that survival now included elements of dignity, care, and human connection. Even the guards, through their consistent and humane conduct, reinforced this environment of predictability and reassurance. Nutritional abundance was not the only lesson. The psychological weight of consistency became apparent. When the body could rely on food, the mind slowly adjusted, shedding some of the chronic anxiety that hunger and deprivation had cultivated. Soldiers discovered that energy returned, that concentration sharpened, and that morale, once considered an abstract or secondary concern, became tangible. The bread was no longer just nourishment. It was a bridge between survival and humanity, between fear and hope. By the end of the first weeks, camp life, once a source of unease, had become a rhythm in which the POWs could tentatively invest themselves. Each tray of bread reinforced a quiet truth. Even in the midst of war, the simple act of feeding men could reshape expectations, mend frayed nerves, and subtly, almost imperceptibly, restore the dignity that conflict had so thoroughly eroded. As the weeks passed, the soft bread and plentiful meals began to do more than nourish bodies. They became a social currency, a subtle force reshaping the dynamics within the camp. Japanese POWs, trained for hierarchy, obedience, and endurance, discovered that abundance created unexpected opportunities for human connection. What had once been survival alone now became survival together, threaded through the simple act of sharing food. In the mess hall, small gestures emerged. A soldier would break his bread in half, offering a piece to a comrade who had missed a tray or arrived late. Others exchanged portions of soup or vegetables, creating informal networks of generosity. These acts, though modest, were profound. They defied the brutal individualism imposed by prior scarcity and nurtured bonds that transcended rank or prior social standing. Friendship, forged in the crucible of deprivation, now found expression in the quiet communion over meals. Private Masaru Fujimoto described it in a letter home. "I have never known that food could speak so loudly. Sharing a slice of bread felt like giving a piece of my own hope to another. We began to watch for each other in ways we never had before. This bread taught us small kindnesses, almost forgotten before the war." For the men, generosity became intertwined with survival instincts. Helping another, even in such a small way, reinforced alliances and reduced the isolation that hunger had once enforced. Yet this new culture of sharing also reflected the subtle persistence of hierarchy. Officers, while participating in distribution, often set the tone. They guided younger soldiers, subtly determining who would receive first or how portions were divided. In some cases, this reinforced familiar structures of authority, yet it did so without cruelty, an adaptation of military order into the humane context of abundance. Bread, soft eka, and unthreatening, became a lens through which social order could be reinterpreted, not as control through scarcity, but as coordination through care. The communal sharing also brought moments of levity and humanity into a setting otherwise defined by war. Men whispered jokes as they passed pieces of bread, laughed quietly at small mistakes in distribution, and even mimicked the gestures of the Allied cooks in playful imitation. These fleeting acts of normalcy were astonishing in their simplicity. They revealed how deeply hunger had dictated behavior, and how quickly the human mind could reorient toward cooperation when deprivation no longer dominated every choice. Perhaps most importantly, sharing food became an act of psychological reassurance. Each gesture affirmed that someone else could be trusted, that the camp environment was not solely a mechanism of control, and that despite the overarching presence of war, human empathy persisted. Bread, a single slice of soft white comfort, had evolved into a medium of connection, a tangible expression of solidarity in a world previously defined by isolation. Through these acts of sharing, the prisoners began to reclaim a piece of their humanity. What had started as astonishment at the simple presence of soft bread now blossomed into the recognition that survival could coexist with care, that indulgence could coexist with discipline, and that even in captivity, men could rediscover the quiet joys of community, fellowship, and trust. In the quiet of the barracks, after trays had been cleared and the hum of camp life had settled into its nightly rhythm, many prisoners took up pen and paper, an act that was as ordinary as it was extraordinary. The letters they wrote to family members carried a mixture of gratitude, disbelief, and almost surreal astonishment. For soldiers who had endured months, sometimes years, of relentless hunger, describing a slice of soft bread became a way of translating the impossible into words. Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka wrote, "The bread here is unlike anything we have known, soft, warm, and filling beyond measure. I almost cannot believe that such a thing exists in the world, let alone that we are allowed to eat it freely. It is as if a small miracle has been placed in our hands each morning." For Tanaka and many others, bread became emblematic not just of sustenance, but of the profound cognitive dissonance that defined life in the camp. The act of writing itself amplified the shock. These men were trained to accept scarcity, to view indulgence as suspicion, and to calculate every morsel of food. Now they were tasked with translating abundance into language, struggling to articulate experiences that their minds had not been prepared to accommodate. One soldier wrote of the bread as if it were a foreign artifact. "I lift it, and it does not crumble. I bite it, and it melts almost too easily in my mouth. How can something so simple hold such power?" The letters reveal a striking contrast between perception and reality. To the Allied staff, a slice of bread was ordinary, a standard element of prisoner sustenance. Yet for the Japanese soldiers, it carried layers of meaning, nourishment, comfort, security, and the shock of kindness extended by the enemy. This disparity highlights the chasm between cultural expectation and lived experience. Bread, something so mundane to the Gion, Verse became almost sacred to the receivers. These letters also illuminate the cultural and emotional shock of captivity. Men who had been indoctrinated to endure hardship and valorize sacrifice were confronted with a reality that contradicted every expectation. Allies were supposed to be harsh, cruel, or at the very least indifferent. Instead, they were generous, consistent, and methodical in care. Writing about this experience forced the prisoners to reconcile their assumptions with the tangible evidence before them. Beyond the physical description, the letters carried an emotional subtext. Soldiers expressed relief, hope, and even disbelief that survival could come without humiliation or pain. For many, bread was more than food. It was a symbol of a world where humanity had not been extinguished. Through these letters, prisoners transmitted not just their astonishment, but a subtle lesson to family and peers, that even amid war there could exist a form of benevolence so simple, yet so profound, it redefined their understanding of endurance and compassion. The cumulative effect of these letters was to preserve memory, not just of hardship, but of revelation. Bread became both sustenance and messenger, a bridge connecting the harsh realities of the camp with the minds and imaginations of those who had not yet witnessed it. Its presence challenged assumptions, reshaped expectations, and became a quiet, enduring emblem of the psychological landscape of POW life. The simple slice of soft white bread, unremarkable in the eyes of the Allied cooks, had evolved into something far greater for the prisoners. A symbol. It was a quiet emblem of abundance, a subtle testament to the efficiency and humanity of the Allied war machine. Where Japanese soldiers had been trained to endure, to suppress need, and to accept deprivation as a measure of discipline, the bread represented a different philosophy altogether, one where nourishment, comfort, and order could coexist, even for captured enemies. For men who had experienced the harsh calculus of survival, this revelation was destabilizing. In the Pacific theaters, food had been weaponized as much as bullets or bayonets. Rations were minimal, distribution uneven, and indulgence practically non-existent. The Japanese military's approach reflected a rigid, almost ideological commitment to endurance. To deny weakness was to honor duty, and scarcity was a tool for forging obedience. Bread, warmth, and care were not merely absent. They were inconceivable luxuries. Now in the mess halls of Allied camps, that logic was turned on its head. Private Kentamori recalled decades later, "I could not understand it. How could the enemy feed us so well? Each bite of bread felt like a paradox. We were captives, yet treated better than we had been in months, perhaps years, in our own supply lines. It was disorienting. Every meal challenged the assumptions instilled in them since enlistment, that survival meant suffering, that enemies could not act with generosity, that discipline required deprivation. The psychological weight of this realization went beyond appetite. Bread became shorthand for a philosophy that contrasted the war-fighting doctrines of both sides. Allies had mastered the machinery of efficiency. Supply chains, nutrition planning, and morale management operated in tandem to sustain not just the body, but the mind. POWs, accustomed to scarcity and rigid control, were confronted with an alternative model, one in which human beings could be fed well, kept healthy, and treated with measured respect even under circumstances of conflict. Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka reflected in his diary, "It was as though the enemy's superiority was not in weapons or strategy alone, but in the way they could organize life itself. Bread, water, warmth, they offered these freely, without pretense or deception. We were prisoners, yet they nourished us as if we mattered." That, perhaps, was the most shocking weapon of all. The impact of this simple sustenance rippled through the camp. Men who had approached meals with suspicion began to anticipate them, to plan their days around the reliable rhythm of nourishment. Respect, perhaps even grudging admiration, took root, not for the enemy as victors in battle, but as custodians of human dignity. Bread, ordinary and mundane to those who produced it, became a tangible measure of moral and logistical superiority. In essence, the slice of bread crystallized a quiet truth. Victory in war is measured not only in strategy and firepower, but also in the capacity to sustain life without cruelty. For the Japanese POWs, this lesson was as humbling as it was disorienting. They had been trained to endure suffering as a sign of strength, yet now, faced with a system that nurtured rather than punished, they confronted an alternative measure of power, one based on humanity, abundance, and meticulous care. Weeks into their stay at the camp, the effects of consistent nutrition began to manifest in ways that were both visible and profound. The POWs, once gaunt and hollow-eyed from months of scarcity, started to regain weight. Sunken cheeks filled out, shoulders straightened, and movements, once sluggish from exhaustion, became more purposeful. Where hunger had dictated every action, the predictable rhythm of meals, bread, soup, and protein, allowed their bodies to recalibrate, to repair, and to reclaim energy that had long been sapped by deprivation. The transformation was subtle at first. Private Masaru Fujimoto noticed it in the mornings. He no longer awoke with the gnawing emptiness that had once dominated his consciousness. His steps, though still cautious, carried more strength, and even the simple act of walking from the barracks to the mess hall no longer left him winded. Officers reported fewer incidents of collapse or illness, and morale, previously fragile, began to solidify into quiet resilience. The soft white bread, unassuming though it appeared, played a surprisingly powerful role in this recovery. Unlike the rice and thin soup they had endured in Japanese supply lines, bread offered concentrated calories, carbohydrates, and a sense of satiety that the prisoners had almost forgotten. It was filling without being heavy, easily digested, and reliable, qualities that helped stabilize the men's weakened systems. Each slice was a small reinforcement, a tangible proof that the body could thrive once deprived for so long. Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka recorded in his diary, "I can feel strength returning. My limbs, once so slow, obey my will with ease. The bread, the meals, they give me not just food, but confidence that I can endure. I had believed that hunger would always control me. Now it does not." His observation captures a crucial truth. Nourishment is more than physical. The consistent provision of food allowed the prisoners' minds to shift focus from mere survival to routine, strategy, and engagement with the world around them. The effects extended beyond energy and endurance. Tasks once dreaded, cleaning, maintaining barracks, or even minor camp labor, became manageable. The men approached work with renewed efficiency, and the camp itself seemed to hum with a quieter, steadier rhythm. Where fear and exhaustion had once dictated the day, predictability and nutrition now governed behavior, reinforcing discipline in a way that was humane rather than coercive. Medical officers in the camp began to take note. Minor illnesses associated with malnutrition, such as scurvy and fatigue-related ailments, decreased noticeably. Muscle tone improved, immune systems strengthened, and mental acuity sharpened. The POWs' physical recovery mirrored a psychological one. As their bodies healed, so too did their capacity for hope, reflection, and engagement with a life that had once seemed unattainable. In this transformation, the soft bread became emblematic of a quiet miracle. Not flashy or ceremonious, it was a simple, reliable sustenance that redefined the men's capacity to endure. Every bite reinforced the unexpected lesson of the camp. Survival did not require perpetual suffering, and human systems could be restored, even in captivity, through care, consistency, and generosity. Decades later, long after the war had ended and the scars of combat had faded from the landscape, many former POWs still carried the memory of that soft white bread. It lingered not merely as a recollection of taste or texture, but as an enduring symbol of something far more profound, a fleeting glimpse of abundance, care, and humanity in the midst of unimaginable deprivation. For men whose youth had been defined by hunger, hard labor, and constant uncertainty, the memory of bread remained almost mythical, a touchstone of hope and astonishment. In interviews and memoirs, soldiers would describe that first slice with almost reverential awe. Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka, reflecting years later, wrote, "Even now I can see it, the soft crust, the warmth, the way it yielded beneath my fingers. It was more than food. It was proof that the world could hold kindness, that suffering did not have to define every day." The recollection was not simply sensory, it was emotional, psychological, and deeply formative. Bread had become a vessel for memory, linking the men to a moment when the impossible had been made real. This enduring imprint underscores the profound impact of abundance in a context where scarcity had been normalized. For years, the POWs had internalized deprivation as a condition of existence. To encounter generosity so quiet, so ordinary in delivery, created a cognitive imprint that lasted a lifetime. The act of being fed well, consistently, and without expectation became inseparable from notions of dignity, trust, and even morality. Bread, ordinary to the Allied staff, had been elevated to an emblem of survival, reassurance, and emotional recovery. Private Masaru Fujimoto reflected on this decades later. "When I speak of bread, I am not speaking only of food. I am speaking of a world I did not think I would live to see. I am speaking of warmth, care, and a strange feeling of safety that remained with me long after I left the camp." In this way, the POW experience demonstrates the subtle but powerful role of simple sustenance in shaping memory and perception. Culturally, bread took on layers of meaning as well. For soldiers raised in a Japanese military tradition that valorized endurance and austerity, this soft white slice defied every lesson they had been taught. It was indulgent, almost decadent, yet morally neutral. It became a marker of contrast, a symbol of another world entirely, one in which life could be preserved and nurtured even amid the machinery of war. Psychologists examining these testimonies have noted that memories tied to scarcity and subsequent abundance are particularly vivid. The first moments of comfort create lasting emotional echoes, forming mental associations that endure far longer than ordinary experiences. For the Japanese POWs, the bread was not only nourishment, but a catalyst for psychological restoration, etching a permanent mark upon their identities and their recollections of the war. In essence, the slice of bread had transcended its immediate purpose. It had become a myth, a memory, and a symbol of hope in a world otherwise defined by deprivation. Its presence, simple though it seemed, carried with it a profound testament to the human capacity to recognize, remember, and treasure acts of care, even when they appear in the smallest, most unassuming forms. For prisoners of war, the expectation of cruelty was instinctive. Years of indoctrination and combat experience had conditioned them to anticipate harsh treatment, to read the enemy's every action as a potential threat, and to measure kindness with suspicion. The Japanese soldiers, hardened by deprivation and a culture that equated endurance with honor, arrived at Allied camps primed for suffering. What they encountered instead was something profoundly disarming: small comforts that carried immense moral weight. The soft bread, warm meals, and orderly routines were not merely sustenance. They were subtle instruments of psychological influence. By providing care and consistency, the Allies disrupted deeply ingrained expectations. Soldiers began to realize that survival did not have to involve fear, coercion, or punishment. The generous treatment, while ordinary to those administering it, became a quiet yet powerful counterpoint to the ideology the prisoners had internalized, that strength required deprivation and discipline demanded suffering. Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka reflected, "I could not reconcile what I was seeing. To be fed well, to be treated with a measure of respect, felt unnatural. And yet it left me strangely unarmed, disoriented, and perhaps grateful. The lessons of our own army seemed hollow compared to this simple act of nourishment." The effect was profound. Small comforts became a moral statement, silently asserting that power need not be expressed through cruelty and that humanity could exist even in wartime. Allied generosity did more than sustain the body. It challenged the prisoners' very worldview. Men who had equated deprivation with honor began to question the rigid structures that had governed their lives. They witnessed a system in which efficiency, care, and ethical treatment could coexist, a stark contrast to the Japanese military's philos, that toughness required constant self-denial. Bread, soft and unassuming, had become a quiet weapon, undermining indoctrination without a single shot fired. In essence, the POWs were experiencing psychological warfare in reverse. Instead of fear and coercion breaking them down, compassion and abundance were subtly reconstructing their perceptions. Hunger, once a tool of control, was neutralized. Morale, often considered secondary in wartime calculations, emerged as a powerful force in shaping behavior, obedience, and human resilience. The impact lingered long after the meals ended. Prisoners internalized the idea that strength could coexist with care, that endurance did not necessitate cruelty, and that acts of generosity, even as small as a slice of bread, could have consequences far greater than physical nourishment. The Allies had shown, without words or ceremony, that in war humanity itself could be a form of quiet power, challenging assumptions and transforming lives. The experience of Japanese POWs in Allied camps, with its emphasis on nourishment, order, and humane treatment, stood in stark contrast to the treatment of Axis prisoners elsewhere. Across Europe and the Pacific, conditions varied dramatically, but the fundamental difference lay in philosophy. Allied camps sought to sustain life and dignity, while many Axis systems, both within Japan and Nazi Germany, viewed prisoners as expendable, instruments of labor, or objects to be broken through deprivation. For Japanese soldiers accustomed to strict rationing and harsh discipline, the abundance of bread and regular meals represented a microcosm of this broader moral divergence. It was a tangible symbol of a camp philosophy that extended beyond simple nutrition. Every act of care, from medical attention to structured routines, was intended to maintain the prisoner's humanity and encourage compliance without fear or cruelty. In essence, bread was a single, visible thread in a larger tapestry of humane treatment. The contrast with other Axis POW experiences was striking. German soldiers captured by the Soviets often endured starvation, exposure, and brutal forced labor. Italian and Japanese POWs in various Japanese-run camps faced similar deprivation, malnutrition, and harsh punishment. Within this context, the soft bread of the Allied camp was more than a meal. It was evidence of a system designed to challenge the brutality of war itself. Where deprivation had been a tool of control in Japanese military doctrine, abundance became a tool of psychological stability and moral assertion in the Allied approach. Historians note that such treatment had long-term effects on reconciliation and historical memory. Prisoners who were treated well were more likely to cooperate post-war, maintain respectful recollections of their captors, and contribute to a narrative that emphasized shared humanity even amid conflict. Bread, humble though it was, became emblematic of this philosophy, a daily reinforcement of dignity that subtly shaped attitudes toward the enemy and toward post-war reconciliation. Private Masaru Fujimoto reflected years later, "We remembered the bread not for its taste alone, but because it represented a choice to see us as men, not as enemies to be starved or broken." That memory stayed with us long after the war ended and shaped the way I viewed humanity itself. The symbolic weight of that nourishment extended beyond the camp walls, influencing survivors' attitudes toward rebuilding, peace, and the lessons of conflict. In this broader view, bread was more than sustenance. It was a cornerstone of a deliberate strategy to assert moral superiority without violence, to rebuild trust in a fractured world, and to illustrate that humane treatment could coexist with military necessity. For the Japanese POWs, it became a lasting emblem of an approach to war that recognized the essential value of human life even amid global conflict. The journey of the Japanese POWs, from initial disbelief to eventual appreciation, reveals that the smallest details of war often carry the largest weight. A single slice of soft bread, unremarkable to the cooks who prepared it, became a symbol of nourishment, comfort, and human dignity. It was a quiet lesson in the power of care, an illustration of how even the simplest acts can reshape minds and bodies, heal fatigue, and restore hope in the most unlikely circumstances. For men hardened by hunger, deprivation, and the rigors of combat, the bread represented more than food. It embodied security, normalcy, and a subtle assertion of morality amidst chaos. Its presence forced prisoners to confront a reality that contradicted everything they had been taught: that enemies could act with generosity, that survival need not come at the cost of dignity, and that life could hold small indulgences even in wartime. Psychologically, the impact was profound. Each bite disrupted years of conditioned endurance, challenged deeply ingrained assumptions, and created a space in which hope and trust could grow. Over time, the rhythm of consistent, generous meals reshaped expectations, healed bodies, and restored the social bonds of camaraderie and mutual care. Bread, simple and ordinary in form, had become extraordinary in effect. Culturally, the experience illuminated contrasts in wartime philosophies. Japanese military doctrine emphasized toughness, austerity, and the suppression of need, whereas the Allied approach demonstrated that human strength could coexist with humane treatment. The lessons extended far beyond the barracks. They spoke to the moral dimensions of leadership, the potential for empathy in conflict, and the enduring power of generosity to leave a lasting imprint on memory and identity. Even decades later, survivors recalled the bread with near mythical reverence. It was a touchstone of memory, a reminder that life in the midst of war need not be stripped of comfort, and that the simplest gestures could carry the weight of a moral statement stronger than any weapon. In the quiet act of providing food, the Allies had delivered a message that transcended calories and sustenance, a message about humanity, dignity, and the subtle power of care. Ultimately, the story of the soft white bread is not just about nourishment or survival. It is about the human need for comfort, the extraordinary psychological impact of small acts of kindness, and the quiet lessons war can teach about empathy, resilience, and moral courage. In the end, one slice of bread revealed the profound truth that even amid destruction and deprivation, humanity can endure and hope can flourish. Subscribe for more forgotten Wabyaibutu stories, where we uncover the hidden human moments that history often overlooks. The story of Japanese POWs and the simple, soft slice of bread reminds us that history is not only written in battles and strategies, but also in quiet acts of care that ripple across lives. These human moments, often overlooked in textbooks, reveal the profound ways in which war shapes both bodies and minds. If you found this journey into the unexpected side of Wabiwiwu compelling, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. We'll continue to explore the hidden, overlooked stories that reveal the human heart amidst conflict. Next, we dive into the seemingly ordinary items prisoners treasured more than weapons, objects that offered comfort, memory, and survival in ways far beyond the battlefield. Stay with us and witness history not just as events, but as lived experience, full of shock, awe, and the unexpected lessons that endure long after the war has ended. Cue cinematic music, swell and fade,